Welcome, everybody, to Recovery Machine. My name's Nathan, and my co-host Corey is here as usual. We are on episode, according to YouTube, 16, and I think we've got them as episode. This will be episode 18.
Yep.
On the audio version. Today is kind of an interesting episode because we're going to bring you up to speed on how Corey's been doing with his back to work process. There's been some development, so I guess I'll start by just asking you how it's going today as far as your current situation.
Yeah, I'm doing really well. Thanks, Nathan. I'm really happy to be doing this episode with you today. This episode has been a long time coming. We've been talking about some of the aspects of this for a very long time. We've been talking about aspects of this since before the start of our podcast, and certainly aspects of this conversation that we're going to have today. We've been thinking about doing as we've been going through the podcast. So this feels like it's kind of been a long time coming, and I'm looking forward to telling a bit more of my story.
Yeah, and I'm interested in making sure that we do a good job of it. In that, I mean, there's various ways we could go about tackling this type of an episode, but I think we've got a good framework to go on, and our goal here is to take as objective of a stance as possible, and that we want to provide everybody with a look at what goes on, the inner workings of the machine. In this one, of course, will be centered around the nursing world, but it's generally the same. Depending on your profession, there might be little differences, but it's generally the same across the board as far as the type of obstacles and things that you meet. So that's our hope. We're gonna kind of give you an insider's view, and hopefully somebody will find that useful. I'm sure they will, especially if they're leaning into or heading in the direction of a back to work.
Absolutely.
Process.
And, as much as we've had some really good feedback about some of our particular episodes where we get into the details of the process and into some snags and some traps that happen along the way and some stumbling blocks that people encounter. And my story happens to have quite a high number of those. And so without, our goal is not to have an episode of complaining, but to have an episode that like you said, that people can learn from, and that for our sincere hope is that people can hear before they get to that point, and it can maybe provide a little bit of guidance or a framework, maybe.
Yeah. Shed some light on the topic. And you're right to say, I mean, I've seen in my work with Obsidian, I think I've seen one or two cases that were more, I don't know, sinister is a weird name, just confusing, or they appeared malicious, and I can't, I don't have evidence to back that up, but they look really weird from the outside looking in, and they ended up in the person being, just. The whole thing was a kind of a terrible experience in that case. Yours is particularly strange in just the series of events that took place. I've never seen so many kind of special meetings and weird twists and turns and stuff.
Yeah.
But, so I guess we'll start by bringing people kind of up back to what was our first episode, which was your introduction, and everybody knows by now what you're doing. But how long have you been off work? We'll remind people about that, I guess.
I've been off work for what is approaching 18 months.
18 months off work. During that time, you completed the treatment program that you were supposed to, the one that you were agreed to complete as part of your contract.
Yeah, I completed that 14 or 15 months ago. So that was that feels like a pretty distant memory in this whole process now, but yeah.
Yeah. And then you also did some proactive work yourself with seeking out therapy.
Yeah, I did. I started my own journey of therapy the first week I went off work, in October of 2020. And I'm still connected with a therapist today. It's certainly not quite as intense as it was. I was doing that weekly, sometimes a couple of times a week. And now I do it a couple of times a month, and it's more for maintenance and to check in, and the topic of discussion is much broader now than it was. It was very, very, addiction focused and recovery focused. So I'm still doing that, actually.
Right. Okay. And still attending. I know you're running one smart meeting as a facilitator. We still have you in Obsidian.
Yep.
And so you're still doing that type of work as well.
Still doing that, still really enjoying it. And I'm with doing the smart meetings still 3 times a week, most weeks.
Okay. And it seems to me, I mean, everybody talks about you as the kind of the model for how one should go through this process in a few different respects. But one of them is your improvement, the way that you kind of went at this problem, and really, I think because you tackled it honestly and you were willing to really do whatever it took. Like going out and finding a therapist that worked, or finding other methods on top of what you were required to do. And I guess I'm wondering how that's impacted you up to this point. I mean, you've had a year and a half of working on this stuff, and what kind of benefits have you seen?
I think, well, thank you. First of all, I think that I'm still very much a work in progress. I see myself as someone who will have to work on aspects of my mental health, particularly for probably for the rest of my life. But yeah, I went into it at the time as though it was my job, and leaned into it pretty hard, and it became quite a busy part of my life. And I, with some of the additional supports that were provided to me through workers' compensation, I had a personal trainer. That was the other thing. So there were weeks with all of the groups I was in and doing rehab and doing personal training where I thought, how would I possibly have time to even work a job with how busy I was? And so as a result of that, I think there's a lot of my thinking that has changed, a lot of the way I have thought about substance use and about my former opiate use, that has really changed. And oh my God, the shift in thinking about community and about the value of connection, and that's been maybe the biggest change. And so those groups, your group included, the smart groups, those are a really important part of my life now, and I still really enjoy those. So yeah, I think that answers part of your question there. But
yeah. I mean, it kind of reflects what most people, whether they're early in or later on in their process of growth, I guess you could call it. It does seem to me like we had somebody in the meeting there. What was it, last week, where they're actually pretending they weren't really mad, but they were, jealous of you, right? Like,
yeah.
How is this guy? And it's always, I mean, the grass is always greener, right? Nobody can be inside your head. And I know that we're similar in that you could, I know there's going to be struggles just like for anybody. And even though you appear to be doing very well, that's kind of a reflection of the work that you've put in. So,
yeah. And I think I was also the timing is different for everyone who gets caught or puts himself, goes to their employer, goes to their college, or however it is that they come forward and have to go off work. For me, it wasn't my choice. As anyone who remembers episode 1, it was my employer who called me and who took me off work. And I was it was a kind of a perfect moment. I felt really ready, and I was kind of desperate. I think I knew that it was needed to come to an end, and that I needed help. And I was kind of starved for some of the things that I was that I was getting, like the counseling and the support, certainly the community, getting physically active, starting to read again. I was starved for all of that stuff. So I was, especially in the first 6 months, I was really willing to kind of soak it in, you know?
Yeah. I understand what you're talking about there. I think people come at, whether they turn themselves in or whether their employer figures out what they're doing or whatever the case may be. You're right. If they're in a place where you sort of need to be at the right spot mentally, where you've been wrestling with the problem long enough so that you realize that you're going to need some kind of large scale change, and the change is so large scale that it's almost impossible to implement without some kind of a massive paradigm shift.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean that it's blissful either. Like,
it's
really bloody hard.
Yeah.
But going back to that episode 1, when I mentioned, that initial feeling of relief, and I was very honest when I said that, like, that's true. I felt like I was out, and like I could see a tiny little pinhole of light coming through. And then, you, like Bruce Cockburn says, you kick at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. And I just started kicking, I think. And finding the right counselor for me, that was probably the biggest thing to break through some of that darkness, I would say.
Yeah. That's an important point, because it's not one that's required usually very rarely will I see an addiction physician require that as part of a return to work agreement or a monitoring contract. But you found it tremendously useful, and others probably could benefit if they find the right fit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the key. Hey,
everybody. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks.